afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Michelle Graff, and I'm the editor-in-chief at National Jeweler. I'm pleased to welcome you to the latest episode of My Next Question, National Jeweler's webinar series. Today, we're doing our special year-end wrap-up episode featuring myself along with the three other National Jeweler editors, Brecken Brandstrader, Ashley Davis, and Lenora Fido. Before we got the webinar started, I just want to let all our attendees know that if they have a question, they can type it into the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of their screens. I'll be back on at the end of the discussion to share any questions. Also, today's session is being recorded and will be available on the National Jeweler website this coming Thursday, December 15th. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and get it started. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, team.
Good afternoon, team. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to everyone who is tuning in. I want to start this year-end in review episode by having everyone summarize 2022 in just a few words. I'm going to start and then I'm going to pass it off to Brecken. So my words that I came up with are exhausting and almost normal. Exhausting because I just felt, I don't know why, I don't know if it's like trying to recover from the pandemic and switching from being at home a lot and not doing much to going out more, but I just felt very tired and very taxed all year, for lack of a better term. I don't know if anyone else felt this way. And then almost normal, obviously as writers living here in New York City, we used to go to a lot of events and go do a lot of travel. And I would say most of that came back this year, and especially towards the end of the year. I remember, I think Brecken, you and I had this discussion when we were at some New York City Jewelry Week events in October. We said something about like, this almost feels normal. Like I remember, like this almost feels like pre-pandemic, like 2019. So for me, those are my two words. It was a lot busier, which was also very tiring, I guess, in summary. Brecken, what about you?
Yeah, I actually said almost the same thing. I picked return to normalcy, semi-normalcy, for the same reasons. I mean, it's not that everything was completely regular all year, but 2022, I think, felt like the first time that things were again resembling pre-pandemic. So we had like a lot of international travel was, back. A lot of people were traveling again for the industry. Not for everywhere. There's still a few quarantine places, I guess, but, it seemed like the trade shows were back in full swing for the most part. Mask mandates were lifting. And there was a lot of, positivity, I think it felt like, even, facing things like the war in Ukraine early in the year and inflation and whether we would be challenged with more waves of COVID and that kind of thing. It still felt like there was this overlying feel of positivity and optimism that things were sort of mostly back.
Okay. Ashley, what about you? Your words for 2020.
Yes, sorry, I have a little noise going on here. So yeah, for me, I said back to business as usual, just because of the way that people were kind of resuming a pre-pandemic way of life, just in terms of meeting each other and while at the same time also kind of still enjoying that boom that jewelry has been experiencing since the pandemic started. So overall, it felt like kind of an optimistic time, in my opinion. And I personally moved back to New York from Miami. So for me, like my year really, really embodied the idea of kind of like back to a previous way of life, but while enjoying some good spending in the jewelry sector. And yeah, that was kind of my take on this year.
So Lenore, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say chaotic, but also fun. I think for all of the reasons you guys said, there was a lot of big stories this year, which we're going to get into later. But also because people were getting back to normal and we had a lot of events and our trade shows were coming back. I don't know that I was used to that level of activity again and, being out so often. But it was fun. It was chaotic, but it was fun. It was great to see everybody again and just sort of get back into the swing of things.
Chaotic is a good word. I wish I'd thought of that. I guess I was too tired to notice. All right. So Lenore, you alluded this to a little bit in your last answer, but we're going to move on to talk about news in the jewelry industry this year. So what, in everybody's opinion, was the biggest story you covered on your beat this year? Just so as a refresher, Brecken covers colored gemstones for us. Lenore covers the financial business, the major, we would call it, the large companies, the financial business side, and Ashley covers new trends, collections, designers. So just so everybody's clear, and I cover the diamond industry. So for me, it absolutely was the February 24th invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which obviously turned the diamond world upside down. As everyone knows, you know, De Beers and Alrosa were kind of neck and neck in being the biggest diamond producers in the world. Alrosa is owned by the Russian government. They fell under sanctions. We're not allowed to import Russian diamonds into the United States. There's a lot of little details here about that I won't go into, but that's kind of generally the story. And obviously when you have, you know, kind of one of the two biggest diamond producers in the world whose goods are ostensibly banned from coming into the biggest market for diamond jewelry in the world, that creates a lot of problems and a lot of stories. It wasn't something I didn't see coming. I mean, not that I'm an expert in Russian foreign policy, but I didn't see it coming. And it definitely, you know, turned the diamond world, turned the jewelry industry upside down. And I remember, you know, when we're coming into the new year, it was like, okay, like diamond jewelry sales are really strong. I was looking forward to kind of like, you know, getting away from so much pandemic coverage and kind of back into a routine of coverage for the jewelry industry. And then the invasion happened and it just became, I mean, for the diamond industry, undoubtedly the story of the year. Brecken, what about you?
I think I probably pick this every year, but I picked my state of the major stories. And so I went not necessarily big in terms of news, but biggest in terms of what I thought content wise was so important. So for those who might have missed it, my state of the major story was, took a big look at the developments, research developments and findings from labs in the past 5 years and sort of did a roundup of that. Because I felt like often those news pieces often come sort of piecemeal. And so some of it can also be really inside baseball. So I thought maybe it would be a good idea to look at all the big ones, wrap them up into one and present them in one story so that the industry could sort of catch up on that. And I think that so many of those things are important for the trade overall to know, not just those who might be dealing in stones. So for example, I think one of them was that a lot of the labs are now testing Podparashah sapphires for color stability because they found that some of them were fading from their Podparashah color to a pink. And so I think that's something if you were selling sapphires, you might want to know. And I also just had a lot of fun writing that one. I like to get into the nitty gritty science of the gemstone news. So it was sort of a good just to test my understanding of that kind of thing. So that's what I picked for mine, the research developments from the labs over the past half decade.
Okay, nice. Lenore, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, for me on the retail beat, I would say the biggest story I covered this year was probably Signet's acquisition of Blue Nile. You know, last year, the major acquisition was LVMH buying Tiffany. Like that was the big story, but
right.
year, it was definitely Signet and Blue Nile. And similar to the last big acquisition, I wrote an analysis piece. I reached out to some industry experts for some insight there. And I just went into the terms of the acquisition and, you know, what does it mean for the jewelry industry as a whole? So that was the big story for me this year. Signet had done some acquisitions last year, you know, Rocksbox and Diamonds Direct. So you could see the company growing, but this was a pretty big move for them.
Okay, and Ashley?
Yeah, for me, so covering design and trends, the biggest sort of news I felt this year for me was Castro's passing, just because it was super unexpected and it was, you know, the story was about a designer who really kind of was coming into his own in terms of the recognition that he was receiving in the industry. And it was just very shocking and people were extremely thrown by it. He had a long career and was definitely reaching the heights of his artistry. And then also had really had some pretty amazing press moments in the New York Times and being featured in the Brilliant and Black Sotheby's sale. And I think people were just really shocked by his passing. I was shocked by his passing. And it was definitely the story that I worked the hardest on this year while writing it, just finding sources to talk to and just having so many conversations and off the record conversations to get to the on the record conversations. So in terms of design, I felt like that stands out to me as the most kind of newsworthy story that I covered this year.
Yeah, and that was a wonderful story you did, Ashley. And it was really sad and shocking for sure. We're going to move on then a little bit to talk about what was and if we've already answered this, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But what was the most surprising thing that happened on your beat this year? And perhaps we've answered this question already, because my answer to this is the answer Lenore just gave, which was I was surprised when Signet acquired Blue Nile. I was very surprised at that. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I didn't see that coming either. I didn't see that coming either. But I thought for me, the most, the one that surprised me the most was Signet acquiring Blue Nile, because that to me kind of was just, wow, that happened. They announced it during their quarterly announcements, right, Lenore?
Sorry, I'm muting myself because my cat is a little loud in the background. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure when they announced it, but it was a shock to me as well.
All right. And Ashley, would you say Castro's passing was also your most surprising story of the year?
Yeah, that was my most surprising. And then in terms of the year at large, just what we discussed with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and just the way that that affected the jewelry industry in terms of sourcing, I think was definitely the most surprising story for me in the first half of the year.
Brecken, any big surprises for you, colored gemstone bead or otherwise?
I think sort of similar to what Ashley said, but like going into colored stones, I think I kept being surprised by how well most people in the sector continue to do this year. I think had you asked me at the beginning of the year, I would have guessed that like inflation and higher prices from, tight supply was going to level things out earlier than it did. Tucson was really strong. I think we had a good holiday season and Tucson was strong. But even as late as like Denver, people were still saying that buying was going well and, things in the market were healthy. So people were really enthusiastic about things up until fairly recently. But that's sort of been the theme, I think, over the last few years is when you guess, how everything is going to affect one thing, it goes the complete opposite way. So.
And sorry,
Yeah.
Brecken, when you say as late as Denver, you're talking about the Hard Rock Summit in Denver.
Yeah, sorry, the
which was
Hard Rock
October?
Summit in September. So like even
September,
though
okay.
in like early mid-September. So even at that point, people were saying, buying is great, things are good. So it's good to
Yeah,
hear.
and I think if I remember correctly, when we did this last year, right around the same time last year, one of the themes we talked about for 2022 was expect jewelry sales to slow down a little bit. Like
Right.
the good times aren't necessarily going to last all through 2022, and that was, and everybody kept, sales are going to slow down. I think they have somewhat, but I think they've stayed strong, like stronger than probably a lot of people expected. I mean, we'll have to see what shakes out this holiday season into 2023, but yeah, the jewelry buying frenzy continues.
Yeah, for sure. And another surprise for me on the retail beat, other than that big acquisition, I was really surprised to see how quickly jewelry and watch companies jumped into the metaverse. It had already been happening with luxury brands in the fashion world for a little while, but I say this lovingly, our industry isn't always as quick to keep up with these tech developments. But we saw Tiffany come out with those CryptoPunk pendants, and then Timex just had their collaboration with Bored Ape Yacht Club. They're doing that like NFT watch collection. And then even like majors like Signet, they partnered with that app DressX on this like virtual physical collection. They call it Phygital. I don't really love that word, but yeah, I mean, that was surprising for me to just see these luxury brands sort of jump into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to an extent, I wonder if the industry didn't learn its lesson from being so late to the game when it came to social media and digital the first time around. Now something new is coming around and they got the message kind of like, okay, like we at least have to try this. We at least have to understand it and see if, just wade into it and see if it's something that is going to work for our business or not. Because that's a really good point, Lenore, too. I too have been surprised to see the number of jewelry and watch companies, like maybe not going full on into the metaverse, but trying it out, like trying things like DressX, like these partnerships with the various NFTs. And did you mention the Tiffany NFT too?
I did, yeah.
Okay, the CryptoPunk pendants. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, they were very cool.
So we talked a little bit about return to normal, and obviously part of that is attending trade shows and events. I want to talk a little bit about our biggest takeaways from where we went this year. And Ashley, I think you were the first to go to the trade show with Vincenzo Oro, unless I'm confusing 2022 with 2021. I don't know, my years are all mixed up anymore. Did you go to Vincenzo at the beginning of this year?
I did.
That seems
I
like
did.
so long ago, right?
That does seem like so long ago. I was trying to remember if that was like 2019 or this year. It was actually this year.
Do you have any takeaways or thoughts about that?
There were tons of people at VO and then tons of people at Couture in Las Vegas and at JCK in Las Vegas. So it definitely felt like the first real return to the trade shows, in my opinion. It was nice to compare and contrast Vegas, for instance, with the September 2021 shows, which were timed that way, of course, because of different surges of COVID. And the shows really felt back to normal compared to September 2021, just in terms of attendance and exhibitors and, I mean, education, the whole thing. It just felt like lots of people, business as usual, and maybe business even better than usual because people had been enjoying a couple of really good years, which will just surprise me forever, of business. So that, yeah, I think it really showed the health of the industry, and was such a welcome change from the year prior.
Yeah, correct. Bracken, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about Tucson, because you went back to Tucson in its normal time this year, in like late January, late February, correct? So
Yeah.
Was Tucson the same? Did you think it was more crowded, less crowded? Because that was kind of like in the US, that would have been the first kind of big litmus test of attendance for the year in my mind, for
Right.
2022.
I would still say it was quieter than normal, but I think because Tucson relies on so many international people still, and at that point, there were still like long quarantines for people coming from Asian countries, I think especially. So there were still, pavilions missing from some of the shows, and, international dealers were gone. But I think when you take that aside, it was still a pretty good show because there were fairly strong numbers when you talk domestically. And what I kept hearing from the exhibitors was that the people that were there for a reason. So they were, there to stock up after the holiday season. So I think the people that came were buying, prices were strong. So I think it was a good show all told for its return. Yeah.
Okay. Lenore, any trade show thoughts or takeaways? Do you want to talk a little bit? You went to Conclave this year, which was in
Oklahoma
Dallas?
City.
Where? Oklahoma
We're
City?
in Oklahoma City, yeah. So yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about Conclave. I'm on the retail beat, so you will usually find me there. I'm going to be there this year. And I had been-
Lexington.
Yes, I had been to 2 previously in Seattle and in Dallas. So this one in Oklahoma City was my 3rd time going. And I would say that this time around, I was pleasantly surprised to see a few new topics being covered, which I thought was nice. I went to a session hosted by the Black and Jewelry Coalition, and they spoke with BIPOC designers, and they had this panel about what it means to leave a legacy, and I thought that was incredibly interesting. And then there was another session that I actually wrote about for National Jeweler about selling to the LGBTQ plus community. And then they also had a session for working parents in the jewelry industry, which I thought was nice. So I'm not really in a position to judge how they're doing in terms of diversity, but I will say that I thought there was an effort being made to be more inclusive and add more new topics to their roster. So I thought that was good.
I would say my take is that, I mean, my big show for the year was going to Vegas. And I thought just from an attendance perspective, it was a lot more crowded than even I expected it to be. Cause I mean, we hadn't been in a few years, so I kind of had lost my gauge of how busy the show was. And then you weren't sure, like, I mean, this was still rewind. This was still 6 months ago at this point, right? This happened May, June. So you weren't sure, like, were people going to come back? Did they figure out they could do their business without going to trade shows? Were they still nervous about COVID? And I mean, people really showed up. I mean, the shows were both Couture and JCK seemed really packed to me. And I'm sure the organizers were pleased. And a lot of people, I mean, there were people there I hadn't seen in 2 years, and everyone seemed really happy to be back together. The other event I went to was a new event. It was called Conversations in Park City and was put together by Jewelers Mutual Group. I loved it. I've said on this wrap up show before, I like smaller shows. I like more curated experiences. It's not as tiring or overwhelming for me to have like smaller group of people, you know, a shorter show and very kind of concentrated topics of conversation. I thought the lineup from Jewelers Mutual was I thought it was a really interesting lineup of speakers. I thought it probably could have been more diverse, just Lenore, taking off on what you said. I thought it could have been more diverse, but I thought there were a couple of really good speakers. One was an executive from the Estee Lauder companies called Liz Bacelar, and she talked about the metaverse, and it was honestly the most kind of like easiest to understand explanation of NFTs and what the metaverse is I've ever heard. And then there was another panel about sustainability, and I thought that, you know, they talked about how to make your business sustainable. And they were talking about sustainability in general, but they got into a little tangent about how to make your business sustainable, which I think can be really overwhelming for small business owners, whether you're a designer, a retailer, manufacturer. And they were talking about the importance of like, these are all the little things you can do to make your business more sustainable. It doesn't have to be like taking these huge expensive steps that you feel so intimidating. Like there's a lot of little things you can do as a business owner to make a difference. And I thought that was really interesting. I really enjoyed that event, and I would go back if they do it again. So now I want to move on to favorite stories of the year, which we talk about this every year. So Bracken, I'm going to start with you. What was your favorite story that you wrote this year?
Well, if I hadn't picked State of the Majors already, I would have, but in the interest of calling out another story, I think the one that I did ahead of Tucson about the tapestry set with 26,000 gemstones was my favorite. It was interesting. It took some like 5 master jewelers, something like 18 months to create, but it was one of those perfect opportunities for a story where it was completely unique. Shelley Sargent from Somewhere in the Rainbow reached out to me directly. We worked on it together, and, you know, just listening to her talk about not only how it was created, but like the kind of issues you have to go through to get something like a tapestry set with 26,000 gemstones across the world to an event for a museum, you know, logistics and insurance. We just had a lot of fun talking about it, and I enjoyed reporting on it and writing about it, and then also getting to see it in person when Tucson rolled around, because I feel like most of the times when we get to write about these crazy things, they're halfway across the world, and, you know, we write the story and say this is so cool, and then that's it. But then I had the opportunity to see it in person in Tucson, and it was incredible. It was absolutely stunning. So I think that was my favorite this year.
Ashley, what about you?
I think that my favorite story that I wrote this year was about a new jewelry book that's out called Ice Cold. It's a history of jewelry's role in hip hop. And firstly, the book is excellent. It's by Vicky Toback, and she, her background is in more of the music side, and she worked for a record label, and then she was in music journalism. So really, really interesting experience. And she's very well versed in the hip hop world. And the book is kind of like a visual diary mixed with essays, and the research is really incredible. Like she tracked down, you know, a lot of designers behind pieces, or like the store where they came from, you know, the private jeweler who made different pieces. And this was a pandemic project for her. It wasn't supposed to be, but it turned into a pandemic project for her. And my conversation with her, just interviewing her about the book, was so interesting, and it, just got a little more philosophical, intellectual about, what does it mean kind of in terms of a legacy and generational wealth, like what is jewelry saying about that in the hip hop world, and the social status of hip hop stars who maybe were embraced by luxury brands at a certain time and now are, partner with Tiffany and are ambassadors for companies like them and are very much, now have that, I guess, mainstream stamp of approval, just like the short trajectory that hip hop has had in the luxury world. So I just thought the conversation was so interesting. It's always really fun to talk to someone who's maybe not quite in the jewelry world, or someone who just comes from such a different perspective, and you get to kind of look at the thing that you cover all the time through a different lens. I feel like those are some of my favorite conversations. So
Yeah,
that was my favorite story to write this year.
that was a great story. Lenore, your favorite story you wrote this year?
Yeah, I think my favorite story I wrote this year was probably the one I wrote around Mother's Day. And it was about my late mom's jewelry. She passed a few years ago, and the story goes into what it was like for me to like finally go through her jewelry boxes and, all of the memories that her jewelry holds. And it was one of those stories where I was kind of like, oh, like maybe this is like too personal. Like even in like our opinion pieces, I don't really delve too deeply into my personal life. But I thought, it would probably be nice to pay tribute, to my mom and her legacy in that way. And I have to say, honestly, I got so much lovely feedback from that story. Like so many people who were touched by it or who were in a similar situation, even now, like months later, I wrote that in like May. I have people say to me, like, I really loved that story. Like, I lost my mom or I lost my grandma. And, I could really relate to that and, how that connection sort of remains through their jewelry. So that was a bittersweet one for me, but it was definitely my favorite story. And I'm glad that I did it.
Yeah, that was also a beautiful story, Lenore. I loved reading that one. We have someone in the comments saying that that was their favorite National Jeweler article of the year.
Thank you.
So I always pick one from each of you because I think you all do a great job, but I also think you all do something different, and it's impossible to pick one because they're all so different. So I'm going to start with Ashley. I loved your story about Tiffany's lock bangle might be its answer to Cartier's love bracelet. I just thought that was such a great story, and it was exact, and it just called it out. I mean, not that it was trying to hide, but it's just exactly what it was. Like this new lock bangle Tiffany made is, in this vein of permanent jewelry, meaning jewelry like the Cartier love bracelet, where you put it on, it's affixed to your wrist, you never take it off. It's supposed to symbolize commitment and connection and love and togetherness. And I thought that was just a really brilliant piece. Did really well too. I thought it was just a really great take. Instead of just saying Tiffany has a new bracelet, I thought that was a really sharp and informative take on it, and I loved it. Brecken, from you, and I'm surprised you didn't call this one out for yourself, but I love the story you did. A news source in Tanzania is producing cobalt blue spinel. I feel like you were the first one to have that story. And I thought
I had it in a few different places because I did really want to pick it. Because to me, it was like my favorite thing to write is like, here's a new source. And there was so much buzz around it when it came out.
Yeah, we were the first ones to have it, I think. Maybe not the first, but we were one of the first. And I just thought it was beautiful material. It was a really interesting story. And that also generated a lot of interest, which is always, something I look at when I'm picking these stories. And Lenore, I was between the lovely story you wrote, Remembering Your Mother, and your story about the Blue Nile Signet acquisition, or the Signet acquisition of Blue Nile, I should say. I just thought that was a really great analysis piece, and it looked a lot at different things, including, is Signet getting too big? Are they acquiring too many things? And we kind of talked to Paul Zimnisky, the analyst, and a couple other people about that. And I thought there were a lot of great insights in that piece. And just so everybody knows, when we put up the recording of this, we'll be including links to all these stories so everyone can find them. And now I want to know, and Lenore, I'll start with you this time. What is your favorite story that someone else on the staff wrote?
So my pick is going to be the story that Brecken wrote about her trip to East Africa and her visiting the mines in Tanzania and Kenya. I thought that was an amazing story. It sounded like such a cool experience, especially seeing all the pictures that she included. And I'm going to embarrass her with praise here, but she deserves it.
Go ahead. I'm just kidding.
Because that story and stories that she does like it are why Brecken is so good at covering her beat, because she is boots on the ground and she is getting her information straight from the source. And she did such a great job with it. That was my favorite story of the year for sure.
From someone else.
From someone else.
From someone else. Ashley, what about you?
So my favorite, I have it pulled up because Lord knows I won't be able to recall the headline exactly otherwise.
Ashley, how dare you not have all the headlines of 2022 memorized?
Oh my goodness. But my favorite was your story, Michelle. In the Radiance, 13 talented designers offer distinctive points of view. That one really stood out to me because I mean, designers and their work, their stories are my favorite part of jewelry. It's, why I love my beat so much. And it's fun to then, just read someone else's take on it on the team. And I thought Michelle did such an amazing job. So the Radiance is the Couture show, their Diversity Action Council's effort to, increase diversity in the show. And which firstly, I think is very topical for 2022 because the jewelry industry has really delivered on promises made in 2020, in my opinion, of creating a more inclusive industry. And I think that that's really, it wasn't just a flash in the pan sort of little effort, but I think that people have really taken thoughtful approaches to figuring out how they can foster talent that may have not had the same opportunities as others. So I think it was super topical, and the designs in the Radiance are beautiful. They had support from De Beers to make these certain capsule collections. So the work itself is beautiful. And then Michelle just went into such detail. Like you went and you talked about every one of the 13
All
lines.
13 designers.
And it was really like, with just sections on each of them, just talking about your take on their work. And it was so thorough. And I just felt like what an amazing tribute to these younger and emerging brands. And, if I was one of those designers, I would really feel seen, like people were paying attention and they came and looked. And I just thought it was a really lovely tribute to all of these talents. And I was like, clicking on each of them and looking at their Instagrams. And, it was really an amazing introduction to a lot of these designers. So that was my favorite.
Oh, thank you, Ashley. I worked really hard on that story. I was happy with how it came out. It was a lot of fun. It also gave me a great appreciation for what you do when I had to get all that caption information and all the pictures. I was like, "Ooh, this is a lot." Brecken, I don't think we've done your favorite one from someone else. And then I screwed up, but we'll come back.
I admit to cheating because I had a list and I was like, I'll pick something that hasn't been brought up yet. So I'm going to go in a fun direction. But I picked Lenore's Halloween post. So for you guys that know, she does a Halloween jewelry post every year. And I'm always curious where she's going to take it next. Like how many times, she's done like cursed jewels and that kind of thing. And this year she went with jewels that give me the creeps. And I loved it so much because it was such a great contrast to the stories that are like, here's, my favorite beautiful jewelry. And not to say that you were outwardly saying that the jewels were ugly or anything, but one of them is a clown with a knife and it's pretty creepy. So I love that the angle that you took there and the time that you took. And I also think that we don't always all take the chance to sort of write up a fun story that's, first person and really get into it in a way that's very personal. And when you all are such great writers, and when you do, and your voices really come out, and I love that. So I picked this one because your voice was very strong in it, Lenore, and it seemed like you had a lot of fun. You're very in your element when you're writing your Halloween jewelry stories. So I liked that one a lot.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I love doing the Halloween story. I'm already trying to figure out what I'm going to do next Halloween.
I think the clown with the knife's going to be pretty hard to top.
He's haunting my desktop as we speak. I probably should have deleted that file.
Michelle, did we
Um,
hear what your favorite story was that you wrote?
No, I screwed up because we were going around talking about your favorite stories that you wrote, and then I talked about the
Yeah,
favorite
you
stories
skipped
from everyone
yourself.
else. So I skipped myself
I
essentially.
wanna-
I'm gonna go with, well, I loved all my Betty White coverage. So there were a few Betty White stories today, 2 or 3, maybe. Because Betty White obviously passed away at the very end. She passed away December 31st, 2021. And I did something about like the jewels she was seen in. And then there were 2 stories, one previewing an auction of her jewelry, and then another one covering it. So those were fun, but I'm going to go in a more serious direction for the story that I like best that I wrote. I like the story I wrote, What Do We Mean When We Say Responsible? And this one I wrote around the time there was at some point, and I can't remember exactly when, I'd have to look it up, but there was a lot of big companies were leaving the Responsible Jewelry Council because they wouldn't take any action on Russia. And, obviously after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Alrosa is owned by the Russian government. So people were upset that they weren't, taking any action against Alrosa as a member of the Responsible Jewelry Council. And it kind of just brought to my mind all these questions of, well, when we say somebody's responsible, what do we mean exactly? Because, Alrosa was always partially owned by the Russian government, and Vladimir Putin's been a bad actor for years. And then I also talked a little bit about a few things that happened with another big diamond company, Rio Tinto, that I thought were kind of questionable. So I was just bringing up this question of, when we say as a company is responsible, what exactly do we mean? And it was an interesting article, and I think I got quite a few emails about it, and it generated a lot of discussion. So that was my favorite article that I wrote this year. So I want to move on now to 2023. And this is going to cover a couple of the questions we actually had come in beforehand, but what are everybody's predictions for their beat in 2023? Lenore, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I mean, retail can be a little unpredictable. How the
As
year
we've
goes.
seen the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, how the year goes financially is going to be dependent on a lot of factors. I mean, there's inflation, COVID, weather, all of those things play into it. So I think what I'll do instead is I will give a little insight into retail trends, because I'm a little more confident on that front. My prediction is that we're going to see more luxury jewelers making a space for themselves in the metaverse, which is something I brought up a little bit earlier. And partly because I think the bigger companies, especially Tiffany, proved that it can work. They priced those CryptoPunk pendants that they came out with at about $50,000, and they all sold out. So, I mean, I think that's going to give certain other players in the industry, confidence to sort of give that a try. And then another trend I would say is that I think the physical store is back in a big way. A lot of the majors from, Brilliant Earth to Watches of Switzerland, they're sort of investing in expanding their store network. So I think we'll see a return of the in-store experience. And then I think some more experimental retail as well, since experience-based purchases are a big competitor for the jewelry industry right now, now that things have pretty much opened up again. So those are go ahead.
There's definitely space there to like tie experiences, like in-store experiences, in the metaverse, and like make it kind of, I know you hate this word, but like a phygital experience. Lenore, I think my prediction is you're gonna have to write the word phygital a lot more than you'd like in 2023.
I think that's a good prediction. I think that's true. Maybe they'll come up with something better.
Right. Brecken, your prediction for 2023.
My guess, I don't know. I find this question hard, and I might be eating my words come middle of next year, but my guess is that, going back to what I was saying earlier about people doing well up through the fall, my guess is that there will be, when it comes to colored stones, a slowdown for the gem market, maybe starting, I think it's already started, but through the holiday season that will continue into Tucson would be my guess in early 2023. Past that, I have no idea. I don't even want to guess, but I'm not saying that I don't think the market will do well at all, because I think we're coming off a pretty high performance this year, but I do think, like we were saying earlier, in comparison to what it has been, I don't think it will be the same. It seems like there's already been a slowdown, like I mentioned, in Q4 starting, and I think inflation and prices are going to start playing into a slowdown. You've got supply constraints still contributing to that too. Tucson's going to be interesting though, because it's such an international event, and I think there's so much still at play. Hong Kong and China, I think, are adjusting their quarantine rules right now. I could be wrong and lightening up on those. So, if that doesn't change, I think we could look forward to more people being back early next year. So hopefully we have a good Tucson, but the Colorstone market's been faring well through the pandemic. So I'm hopeful that that'll still be the story in 2023. I think there's a lot of good things to come for gems when it comes to, consumer interest in terms of looking for new options and, finding their way into new and interesting stones that are going to help bolster it through the year.
Okay, Ashley?
Yeah, for me, I think that, the financial downturn is coming. And I think that it's, the pandemic was so oddly specific in that some people were doing financially well at that time, and then not spending on their vacations, and so there was more disposable income for jewelry. This just feels so different. Things just feel so rocky globally, and in terms of finances and like the housing market, for instance. It just feels like I think some financial conservatism is going to be coming into play. And in terms of design, I mean, so many designers right now have like really strong client bases that I don't think people are going anywhere. I mean, maybe some of their projects become just a little, maybe less of the really high ticket, fun, exciting, custom, one of a kind projects. Maybe like the budgets shrink for that, but I still think that designers will be churning out all the new collections with lots of color. I think some resurgence of white gold actually will be coming back. Just I'm like seeing more two-tone now. So I think there's, maybe a market for that since yellow gold has been so dominant. Maybe more white gold and diamonds, but I still think color, and I still think a lot of innovation from independent brands. And yeah, I think lots of good design to come in the year ahead. Maybe some better price points for the average shopper. I think they'll be like, I think it was Meredith Marks who I saw this fall, and she has a lot of silver pieces in her collection. And she was like, the reason that I have silver pieces is because I launched in like 2008 or something. So I think, we'll just see some pivoting in terms of that, like some smaller pieces. We'll see.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I've heard murmurs before about white gold kind of coming back to an extent. And then if what you're saying is true, that people are going to be, going down on price point a little bit, that could mean a lot of designers then just turning to silver. So my prediction for 2023 is a bold one. And I don't know if it's a prediction, it's kind of a prediction question. A few weeks ago, we wrote about a report that Sergey Ivanov, the CEO of Sergey Ivanov Jr., the CEO of Alrosa, was going to be stepping down from the company before his contract expired. This was a report from another news source. When we asked Alrosa about it, they did their decline to comment, which to me, if the report was wrong, wouldn't they have just, in my mind, wouldn't they have just denied it and said, no, that's not true, rather than just, sometimes to me, decline to comment is like kind of confirmation. So I'm wondering if, starting with this move by Sergey Ivanov Jr., I wonder if we're going to see Alrosa in 2023 try to untangle itself from the Russian government so that it can get back to business as usual. Because before the pandemic, Rosa was involved in all the CSR, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, they were considered like a model company in the industry. And I'm wondering if this development with their CEO isn't maybe the first kind of step towards them detangling themselves from the Russian government so they can go back to business as usual. And that's a big prediction, but that's the first thing that came to mind when I read that news about the CEO. So we'll
They
see.
able to extricate themselves from the Russian government?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's a very complicated question. I haven't really looked into it, but that's the first thing I thought when I heard that he'd be leaving. Because sorry, I didn't explain. He is under sanction too, both because he's on the board of the bank and both because his father is a high-ranking Russian official. So he is under sanction as well. So if he leaves, perhaps that's one step towards them extricating themselves from the Russian government. I don't know. I don't know if that's something they can do or would do, but that's the first thought that came to mind when I read that he would be leaving. Not a prediction, more of a prediction question, but that's what I'm thinking about right now. So I'm going to end with summarize your hopes for 2023 in a few words. And Brecken, I'll start with you. Your hopes
Sure.
for 2023 in a few words.
So when I was thinking of colored stones, I went pretty niche, but I was saying in 5 words, productive conversations for transparency. I mean, this is something we've obviously had conversations around for a while now, but sometimes it seems like people can get a little bit overwhelmed or there's so many buzzwords that they get lost in it. But you guys were talking about some of the conversations that happened this year, so that we know now that it's necessary for businesses and these conversations have to happen. And I feel that within the last year or two, there have been a lot more examples in industry conversations of exactly how people are doing that, from things like how smaller dealers are shoring up their supply chains to things like more established programs, like things like Moyo that we talk about all the time, how they're helping to bring formalization of ASM in a way that can make a lot of people feel like if they took part in it, it would go a long way to toward traceability for them. So that's an area I feel pretty strongly about. And I hope that in 2023, we're able to continue to make strides in really concrete and have conversations that are really actionable with actionable steps for people to sort of continue that progress.
Ashley, hopes for 2023 in a few words.
I would say strong jewelry sales, just because I love the mood of designers who are doing really well and just have more business they can handle. I love how people design in that type of exuberant atmosphere because we've just seen so much color and so many stones in designs in the last couple of years, and so many really cool one-of-a-kind pieces where people are, finding these big budget clients to do these dream projects that they want to do. I think just from a design perspective, that climate is really great for design lovers. I think of like the Harwell Godfreys and the Brent Neals and Emily Wheelers, who just have this fun, fantastic jewelry where they're sourcing really interesting stones and, putting together these colorful fantasies. I like that attitude of not playing it safe and people not just buying the diamonds because they know that they're a good investment, but buying really more interesting jewelry. So that's what I would hope for more of, so that designers have that artistic license in 2023.
Very nice. Lenore.
Yeah, when you asked that question, it reminded me of like years ago, and I would ask my mom, like for Christmas or for Mother's Day, like, what do you want? And she would always say the same thing. She was like, I just want you all to be happy. And like back then I would think like, what a silly thing to say. Like, can you tell me an actual thing that I can buy in a store? But like, I get it now. And so my hopes for 2023 is just that we have like a happy year, that it's a good year for us and it's a good year for retailers, and that we just continue to have these opportunities to safely gather together and celebrate as an industry and see new jewelry. So I'm just hoping for a happy year.
Oh, I love
That's a good
that. I'm
answer.
hoping for a happy year too. What I wrote down was more rest and more web traffic, which
Michelle's
is,
tired.
I am tired. But those were my hopes for next year, like the National Jeweler have a good year, strong web traffic, and just like more opportunities for rest and relaxation. But I get what you're saying, Lenore. Like I also would like a happy year. Like
Yeah.
maybe things next year could just be like a little less stressful and hectic. I feel like we could use that, or I could use that anyway.
Happier, easier year. Yeah.
Happy year, easier year, exactly. Thank you all. That was a great discussion. As a reminder to our attendees, you can still type questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and I'm going to try to get to as many as possible. We had quite a few come in before the webinar, so I'm going to start with those first while people type questions in if they come to them. Here's one that they came in beforehand that I thought was so interesting, and I have an answer for this, and I'm going to pass it off to whoever wants to answer. Somebody asked, any trends you notice consumers steering away from lately, quote, dying trends? And I thought that was so interesting because we tend to talk about trends like, oh, these are the new trends, but we don't tend to talk like so much as like when trends fade away. And I'm wondering, and Ashley, you can jump in here, if we're going to see a movement away from all the layering and all the tiny little jewelry to like more singular, big, bold pieces instead of like, 3 little necklaces, 5 little bracelets, or the neck mess, all the stacking. Are people getting tired of that, or is there a more of a shift to like one kind of statement jewel? Ashley, do you see that at all?
I think for that, there's a practicality element there, which is just that a really big piece is going to cost a lot of money. And, gold is very, very expensive. So I think, it's just in a, it's just a styling kind of philosophy toward the maximalist, but who exists, in real life, not with an endless budget. So, I mean, I think the neck mess, maybe it will be less prominent, but I think that, I mean, small pendants are always going to be an amazing gifting item, an amazing self-purchase item. So I don't think the layering will go away. For me, I think maybe a bolder element I think we see in bridal is like a focus again on the center stone, or having a 3-stone or a 2-stone ring, as opposed to the halo settings that were just sort of like, I mean, I feel like there was a decade of that. Yeah. And I feel like that has really kind of plummeted in terms of popularity. Not that it's unpopular, but that it was so popular and now it's like really leveled off to something more normal. So I think in terms of that, maybe going a little bit bolder, cleaner, not so many elements, I think that does really apply to bridal.
Yeah, the kind of just 1 stone on a simple band or 2 stones, it's a really clean look. I think people are embracing that. Lenore, Brecken, any quote dying trends from your end?
I'm thinking, I was interested in what Ashley was saying earlier about white gold possibly coming back, because I, for a long time, was white gold, silver all the way, and you all talked me into yellow gold, and I'm finally wearing it, and now here is Ashley telling me that white gold might be coming back.
Well, I mean, at least you're prepared.
That's something on my radar.
But more out of spite. Is that what you're telling me?
More out of spite. Yeah, I'm bringing back all the silver. You can say whatever you want.
Whatever, at least you're prepared. Somebody just asked a good question in the chat, and I'm sorry, again, we're not going to get to all of these. We just have a couple minutes left, but what was your 2021 prediction for 2022 and why were you wrong? Wow, so you're assuming we were wrong. So that's an interesting way to phrase it. But I think we kind of already covered this, that I think we all I think when we sat here last year, we all were like, oh, jewelry sales are going to slow down. Like 2020 and 2021 were these, outliers, and 2022 is not going to be as robust. And I think all year, everyone was like kind of waiting for the slowdowns, like what's the show's going to be like. Then Brecken, you mentioned, it was September and the Hard Rock Summit in Denver was still crowded. So I think that I guess what we were wrong about is the jewelry sales continue to be strong. And I think they continue to surprise. Again, I think when all is said and done, 2022 will not be at the level of 2021. But I think we all expected a sharper downturn in sales at some point in the year that kind of never materialized. Now we're sitting here saying 2023, now what's going to happen in 2023? And, maybe we'll be sitting here again a year from now and saying, nope, jewelry sales are still really strong and we didn't see that slow down. Anyone else remember any 2021 predictions for 2022 that didn't turn out?
Nothing pops up.
Yeah.
I was gonna say the same. I think I thought that there would be like a big downturn this year that I don't think we saw. I think it was still really a good year. I think we were almost like pinching ourselves in that respect, like with people so happy and buzzing in the industry. We're like, this can't last. And I'm basically making the same prediction for 2023, but I was wrong about it in 2022. So hopefully I'm wrong about it in 2023 as well.
Now we have a question I want to take because it's related to a story we talked a lot about here, which is Signet's acquisition of Blue Nile. Lenore, I'm going to direct this to you because you talked about this. This is a question we addressed in your analysis piece. And this is the question: with chains like Signet, quote, taking over, do you think there will be a market for individual jewelers in the future?
Yeah. I mean, I think, to be fair, Signet is a giant, right? And they're buying up more companies, they're growing, and this is in the analysis story, Signet's market share is still only in the low double digits percentage in the US. So the rest of that, let's say 85, 90, whatever percent it is, that's all for, the others and for independent jewelers. So there is definitely a space for independent jewelers. I don't know that we're seeing, this big antitrust issue. I think the industry is still pretty fragmented. So I think there's space for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. When I think about the jewelry industry, one thing I always think about is how we're one of the few industries left in the United States where there's still so many family-owned business. Like, how many family-owned drugstores are there? Like my grandfather owned a hardware store. Now, how many neighborhood locally owned hardware? I know it was called Box Hardware. That was his last name. Like, how many stores like this still exist? How many locally owned hardware stores, locally owned pharmacies? I mean, locally owned grocery stores? Like, almost all industries are just basically comprised of, for the large part, big chains. I think the jewelry industry, in my opinion, would be one of the industries in this country where it's still a lot of family-owned businesses. And I think I get that people get nervous when they see, oh, it's another acquisition from Signet. Right. But like you said, Lenore, there's still a lot of independent jewelry stores. Yeah. Then there's still a lot, and it's still a very fragmented industry. Yeah. So it's not, Signet is making acquisitions, but it's not to the level where we're now an industry that's controlled all by one major company. That's not the case at all.
No, I wouldn't say so. I think
still, I have to assume a lot of consumers that would prefer to go to, specialists at a small family-owned store than maybe some of the bigger box stores. So
yeah, I think, and this is not a knock against Signet, but I think with a product like fine jewelry, I think your local neighborhood jeweler who's knowledgeable still carries a lot of weight with a lot of people.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Taking your stuff in there, asking questions, you do your research on the internet, and then you go in there and you ask questions. What about this? I saw this on the internet. Can you explain the difference between these stones or these metals, etc.? I think jewelers still have a huge part to play in kind of demystifying this very sexy, very desirable product that's, relatively expensive. So people want to ask questions and understand what they're getting.
Yeah.
So somebody asked, and I want to read, we talked a little bit about dyeing trends, but this is always a question we get, and it's probably the last one I'm going to take here today. I apologize we didn't get to all these questions, but what would you say was the biggest jewelry trend in both fashion and bridal this year? And Ashley, I'm going to throw that one to you, and anyone else can pop in as well. Biggest trend, bridal first, then we'll do fashion.
In bridal, I feel like the biggest trend was just simplicity this year, which was like going back to a solitaire. The other trends that we talk about are very niche. Like a two-stone is still very niche. When we're talking overall,
Right.
I felt like the biggest trend was a diamond solitaire. Um, People are getting more creative in the stacking, and there are always possibilities. But I think that it's when we're truly talking about across America, the most sales would be a solitaire. When it comes to design, and this is going a little bit more niche, color, I felt like was the biggest trend. And part of that is just is the price of gold, designers using like a lot more inlay, and branching out into such different stones. Like the inlay isn't just malachite, you know, you'll have green turquoise. Like there's such a passion for sourcing different materials, and you know, I think designers just love the hunt of that. So I think color, statement earrings, different stones is one of the biggest trends. Enamel as well. A lot of cool designers doing enamel, and just customizing their shades, doing different shades of it. It's really just like going beyond the typical color and branching into different shades, I would say.
And Ashley and Brecken, this is a question for both of you. Do you think this affinity towards color, trend of color, is kind of people's way of trying to find joy and celebrate like coming out of a very difficult time?
I think that psychologically you could say that. And then part of it, I think, is just the exposure we have through social media. You just have a platform. Like it used to be so much more contained, like what we would see. Like we would see like
Right.
a Blue Nile ad, you know, like, and now we just have access to so much, and you know, influencers and retailers and designers, that I just think that we see more, so that it's not it's just become less classic altogether. But what do you think about that, Brecken?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, because I was gonna say it seems to me, I mean, I think on the wholesale side, if you look at how color was doing, that even before the pandemic, people were saying it's so hot, there's so much happening. And maybe to your point, Ashley, like people are seeing it more, so they realize I don't have to buy a solitaire diamond for my engagement ring if I don't want to, or I can get really sort of funky. I kind of like watching what's happening in terms of cuts for color too, because it's not just the color, it's like the way that they're doing fun cuts now. Like I saw recently somebody doing rose cuts for a colored stone, which I thought was awesome. It's so cool. And so I just think it's also like my generation maybe just realizing that they have like a lot of other cool options. The more they see, the more they want to dive into it and they go further into it. And it's, you know, it offers them good options and they can play around within that kind of thing.
One thing worth mentioning in terms of bridal, for people who are looking for the alternative engagement, I feel like everyone is getting morganite for their alternative engagement stone. And obviously price point is a part of that, but I have been noticing that again for something much more niche, and we're talking about not the typical bridal consumer. But morganite has become like a big thing.
Well, I think it's a price point, and I think people like that color, that like very soft pink, I think is appealing to a lot of people.
Yeah.
I feel
pink
like
pink
if we
has really
watch,
come along in recent years. Like pink is
and because
popular.
it used to be also like pops of like pink sapphires, bright pink sapphires for the past few years was like as all people were telling me about when I would go to shows. But then I think through this year, I think we talked it in a different session also about light greens, because it was like all of a sudden from summer on, people were saying like my mint green tourmalines are selling so fast. So I think maybe maybe we're getting away from like vibrancy into pastels. But then again, you know, colored stones are so personal that like I think when you talk about a color trend, nothing is ever so huge. But maybe pastels. That's a good point, Ashley. Like maybe that's just something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I thought of something where we're talking like when we talk about trends. I saw, and this is always the case, but I feel like I saw more and more of these jewels in 2022, these convertible jewels where it's a necklace and you can wear it four different ways. You can wear it longer, you can wear it shorter. a lot of earrings and necklaces and different things with detachable charms. Wear it without the charms, you know, pick and choose your charms, build on your charms. I mean, it's always a trend, but I thought I saw more and more of it when they were coming out with jewels this year. There were more and more things where they were selling it as, you know, one piece, 3 different ways, 5 different ways, however you want to wear it, which I think, like, I mean, obviously designers have been doing for years, but I felt like I saw more of that this year.
Right. Yeah, and I think we mentioned it when we were all together before for our Vegas recap, when we were talking about some of the things that we had seen. We'd mentioned a lot of color and then a lot of the convertible jewels as well. And I remember back then we were sort of tying it into inflation. And you know, if I only have X dollars to spend on this piece, I need this piece to do a couple of different things. I need day to night earrings. I need the necklace to be convertible. Yeah, so I think that could be a part of it as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much all for joining me today. Ashley, Breck, and Lenore, thank you so much. We're a little bit over time, so I'm sorry we're not going to get to everyone's questions, but I want to thank all our readers and all our listeners and subscribers all year. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your attention. I hope this was helpful, and happy holidays to everyone.
Thank
happy
you.
holidays.
Happy
Bye.
holidays.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.